Have you ever felt invisible? Like no one sees you, no one cares about you. Like everything you've done has been forgotten? What if one moment could change everything? What if someone unexpected saw you when you didn't expect it, and in the blink of an eye, your entire life was thrown into a whirlwind? Thomas Malone's life had always been a quiet one. He was a man who had seen a lot during his time in the military, but since returning to civilian life, he had mostly kept to himself. His days were spent at the local bank, working as a teller, serving customers with a practiced smile. Outside of work, he had little connection to anyone. His past, filled with memories of war, was locked away deep inside him, kept hidden from the world. And then, one day, everything changed. It started with a regular morning at the bank. The doors swung open, and a customer walked in. A middle-aged man, tall, with dark hair and a scruffy beard. He approached the counter, holding a check, and after a few routine questions, he handed it over to Thomas. "Can I get this cashed?" the man asked, his voice gruff. As Thomas processed the check, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about the man seemed off. There was a tension in the air. It wasn't just the usual discomfort of a long workday or a routine customer interaction. There was something else, an unease that crept up from the pit of his stomach. "I'll need to see some ID," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the strange sensation gnawing at him. The man nodded, pulling out a worn wallet and handing over his driver's license. It was then that Thomas's world seemed to freeze for a moment. He looked down at the ID, his eyes scanning the name, Raymond Fields. Raymond Fields. The name alone sent a wave of memories rushing through his mind, memories he'd long since tried to bury. The man standing before him wasn't just a stranger. He was someone Thomas had known from his days in the army, a fellow soldier. But it wasn't just any soldier. It was Raymond, the one who had been there during the hardest of times, the one who had always had his back. Or so Thomas had thought. What was Raymond doing here? Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he passed back the ID. The moment stretched out, too long for comfort, as Raymond took it and looked at Thomas, his eyes unreadable. "Everything okay?" Raymond asked, his tone flat, almost bored. Thomas could barely get the words out. "You're Raymond Fields?" His voice cracked a little, betraying his unease. Raymond raised an eyebrow. "You don't recognize me?" It wasn't that Thomas didn't recognize him. It was the feeling that Raymond had changed, that something about him had become different. He wasn't the man Thomas remembered. "Yeah, I recognize you," Thomas muttered, trying to regain his composure. He forced a smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You used to be a lot different." Raymond didn't respond to that, just let out a small laugh and looked around the bank as if the encounter were nothing more than a passing moment. But for Thomas, it wasn't just a passing moment. It was a blast from the past, an event that would kickstart a series of events that would unravel everything he thought he knew about his life. As Raymond left the counter and walked out the door, Thomas stood there, still staring at the space where he'd been standing just moments before. The sensation of disorientation didn't fade. Instead, it deepened. What did this mean? What was Raymond doing here? The last time Thomas had seen him, it was under circumstances that he didn't like to remember. The war had taken its toll on them both, but Raymond had been different after they returned. He had changed in a way that left Thomas wondering if they had really known each other at all. For the first time in a long while, Thomas felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. It was a sense of urgency, like the past had come knocking on his door, asking for answers. But he wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Thomas shook his head, trying to clear the thoughts swirling in his mind. He had a job to do, after all. He had customers to serve and a life to continue. But in the back of his mind, one question lingered. Why had Raymond come back into his life now? Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Thomas Malone sat behind the counter at the bank, his hands steady on the polished surface, but his mind was miles away. The encounter with Raymond Fields had left him rattled, pulling at the threads of memories he'd spent years trying to bury. It had been over a decade since he had last seen Raymond, and yet the recollections flooded back with startling clarity. They weren't memories Thomas liked to revisit. Those days, the pain, the scars, both physical and emotional, still haunted him. Thomas had always kept his past close to his chest. He had learned early in life that some things weren't meant to be shared. His years in the military had been formative, but not in the way that people outside of it might think. There was camaraderie, of course, but there was also loss, betrayal, and fear. He'd seen things no one should ever have to witness, things that had changed him forever. Born and raised in a small town in Ohio, Thomas had always been a quiet, hardworking kid. He joined the military straight out of high school, eager to escape his small town life and prove himself. The structure of the army appealed to him, the sense of purpose and discipline it offered. He had been trained as a combat medic, tasked with saving lives on the battlefield, but those same hands had also been forced to hold the lives of comrades who didn't make it back. That's where Raymond had come into the picture. Raymond had been the kind of guy you could count on, or so Thomas had thought. They were close during their deployment, both medic and soldier, both working side by side under grueling conditions, both trying to hold on to their humanity in a place where it was easy to lose. But the war had a way of changing people. Thomas learned the hard way. It wasn't just the things you saw. It was how those things followed you back home. Raymond had come back from deployment with a distance in his eyes that Thomas couldn't quite explain. The bond they once had began to fray as Raymond became more withdrawn. The camaraderie they'd shared seemed to vanish, replaced by coldness. The betrayal was subtle at first, but Thomas felt it all the same. Raymond didn't return his calls, didn't want to meet up for drinks like they used to, and Thomas had no idea why. By the time Thomas was honorably discharged and returned to civilian life, Raymond was a ghost in his past, gone, without explanation, without a word. But that was the way things went, Thomas supposed. People change. People disappear. It had happened to him once before, and he wasn't sure it would happen again. But then Raymond had come back into his life today, stirring up old ghosts that Thomas wasn't ready to face. As Thomas tried to refocus, his mind drifted back to his family. There was his ex-wife, Diane, the woman who had once been his world, and their son, Daniel. Diane had left him years ago. The strain of their relationship had grown unbearable after his return from war. He had become a shell of the man he once was, his silence and distance driving a wedge between them. Despite his best efforts, he had lost her, and with her, he had lost the kind of family he had always wanted. Daniel had been just a child when his parents separated, but even now, Thomas could still remember the look on his son's face, the sadness in his eyes as he clutched his mother's hand the day she told him that things were over. It had been hard to find a way back after that, especially since he had never been great at expressing his emotions. His relationship with Daniel had been strained over the years. There were birthdays, holidays, and milestones that he had missed. There were years when he had felt like a stranger in his own son's life. He tried to reach out, letters, calls, but the distance between them only seemed to grow. Thomas often wondered if he'd been a good father, if he could have done more. But the truth was, he had been drowning in his own pain. The trauma from the war, the failure of his marriage, the isolation, everything had weighed on him. It had all built up to the point where he had convinced himself that maybe he wasn't meant for close relationships, maybe he wasn't meant to be loved. He had learned to be okay with being alone. Yet, despite everything, there was a part of him that still longed for connection, for redemption. The conversation with Daniel, however brief and awkward, had ignited something inside him. There was hope. Maybe he wasn't too far gone. Maybe he could rebuild what had been lost. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas's thoughts were interrupted by the familiar buzz of the bank's front door opening. A steady stream of customers came in, pulling him back into the rhythm of his work. But no matter how busy he got, his mind kept returning to Raymond. What had happened to him? Why had he shown up today, after all these years? Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that their meeting was no accident. The past had a way of coming back to haunt you when you least expected it. And for the first time in years, Thomas felt like he was on the edge of something, a shift in his life that he didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. What did Raymond want? And how would it change everything? The bank's fluorescent lights buzzed above Thomas, but his thoughts were far from the routine transactions unfolding around him. He was distracted, too distracted to focus on his customers, too distracted to care about the usual daily grind. Ever since Raymond Fields walked back into his life, it felt like everything was on the verge of changing, and Thomas wasn't sure he was ready for whatever that change might bring. The rest of the day passed in a blur of monotony, with customers coming and going. Yet no matter how hard he tried to immerse himself in his work, he couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that had taken root in his chest. There was a question nagging at him, pulling at him like a weight. Why had Raymond come back? As the hours dragged on, the unease only grew. He hadn't heard from Daniel in over a week, not since their brief phone conversation. Was he avoiding his father on purpose? Or was he just busy with life? After all, Thomas had done nothing to prove that he was worthy of his son's time or affection. But there had been something in Daniel's voice that day. A glimmer of something, maybe hope? He couldn't be sure. At the end of his shift, as the bank slowly emptied of customers, Thomas sat down in the break room and tried to clear his head. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the messages. Nothing. He stared at the blank screen for a moment, debating whether or not to send Daniel a text. The fear of rejection held him back, but the desire to reach out overpowered it. Just as his fingers hovered over the screen, his phone buzzed. It was an email, an alert from the bank system. He opened it, expecting another routine update. Instead, he froze when he saw the subject line. Suspicious activity report, Raymond Fields. His heart skipped a beat. What was this about? Raymond had been nothing but a quiet customer in the bank. But now this. Something was off, and Thomas knew it. Without thinking, he clicked the email open, his eyes scanning the details. There it was. Raymond had been flagged for suspicious financial activity. It was subtle at first. Small withdrawals, odd transactions, the kind of things that raised alarms but weren't necessarily illegal. But it wasn't just the transactions that caught Thomas's attention. It was the sudden spike in activity. It didn't make sense. Why now? Thomas's pulse quickened as he read through the rest of the report. The timing seemed deliberate. Raymond's actions were erratic, an abrupt change from the man Thomas remembered. But what did it mean? Was Raymond in trouble? Or was he involved in something dangerous? The old bond of shared experiences during their time in the army resurfaced within Thomas, and the instinct to protect kicked in. No matter what had happened between them in the years since the war, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that Raymond needed help. But that didn't mean things were simple. What if Raymond was involved in something criminal? Thomas's head swirled with conflicting thoughts. Could he afford to help Raymond, given the years of distance between them? Or would he be risking everything by getting involved in a situation he didn't understand? As Thomas pondered, the door to the break room opened, and one of his co-workers, a young woman named Sarah, stepped in. She gave him a curious glance, noticing his tense posture and the way his eyes were glued to the screen. "You all right, Tom?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. Thomas quickly minimized the email and forced a smile, trying to shake off the feelings of doubt and uncertainty swirling inside him. "Yeah, just a bit of a long day," he said, lying through his teeth. "Nothing I can't handle." Sarah gave him a skeptical look, but didn't push further. "Well, if you need a distraction, we're grabbing drinks after work. You should join us. You've been quiet lately." The invitation was innocent enough, but Thomas could feel the weight of his internal conflict pressing down on him. How could he explain what was going on in his mind? How could he tell her that a ghost from his past had reappeared and that everything he thought he knew about his life was suddenly up in the air? "I'll pass tonight, Sarah," Thomas replied, forcing the words out even though he wasn't entirely sure why. He'd never been one for socializing much, but tonight, there was something more pressing. "Got some stuff I need to sort out." With a nod and a quick goodbye, Sarah left the room, and Thomas was left alone with his thoughts. He stared at his phone again, the email flashing before his eyes. The sense of unease that had settled into his bones refused to leave. Thomas stood up abruptly, the decision weighing heavily on his chest. If Raymond was in trouble, if he was mixed up in something shady, Thomas wasn't sure what to do. But he knew he couldn't just ignore it. Not after everything they had been through together. The door to the bank's office creaked open, and Thomas glanced up to see his manager, Michael, approaching. Michael was a tall, no-nonsense type of guy, always focused on the job and never prone to small talk. He stopped in front of Thomas's desk, his expression unreadable. "Hey, Tom. I need to talk to you about something," Michael said, his tone serious. Thomas nodded, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. "What's up?" Michael's gaze flicked toward the computer screen in front of Thomas. "We've got a report on Raymond Fields. I'm going to need you to keep an eye on him. We can't have any more issues with security or fraudulent activity." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "What kind of issues?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just routine stuff. Nothing major, but I'm not going to ignore it." Michael's tone was final, almost cold. "I need you to be extra vigilant when he comes in." "Got it." Thomas's heart raced. He wanted to speak up, to ask about what had really been going on with Raymond, but instead, he nodded silently. The conflict in his chest grew more pronounced. He could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of old ties and new responsibilities pulling him in opposite directions. As Michael walked away, Thomas was left with his thoughts, the report still open on his phone. This wasn't just about Raymond anymore. This was about everything Thomas had buried. His past, his regrets, and now, his son, Daniel. There was something bigger at play here, something Thomas couldn't quite understand, but one thing was for sure. He wasn't going to back down this time. The storm was coming. The next morning, Thomas barely slept. The events of the day before swirled in his mind, clashing together like a storm ready to break. The pressure to keep his distance, as his manager had instructed, weighed heavily on him, but there was a tug deep inside, an unexplainable pull that made him feel like he couldn't walk away this time. He stood in front of the mirror, looking at the tired man staring back at him. His face was lined with the experiences of a life he could never fully escape from, a life that had taught him how to survive, but not always how to live. Raymond's return had thrown him off balance, and he knew that today would either be the start of something new or the unraveling of everything he had tried to keep hidden. As he left his apartment, the cold air bit at his face, but it didn't faze him. He barely noticed it. The bus ride to the bank felt longer than usual, as though time itself was slowing down, as though the world was holding its breath. It was still early. Most people hadn't arrived at work yet, but Thomas knew this would be a long day. When he stepped into the bank, the familiar scent of coffee and paper greeted him, but the unease still lingered, gnawing at him. He clocked in, and his manager, Michael, gave him a quick nod before heading into the back office. It was going to be another quiet day of routine banking, or so he thought, but he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to change. Around noon, Raymond walked in. His presence in the bank was jarring. It wasn't just that he had reappeared after all these years. It was the way he walked now. His posture was different, almost haunted, as if he was carrying something invisible that weighed him down. And there was a look in his eyes, something desperate and distant. Thomas watched as Raymond stood in line, his fingers drumming on the counter as he waited. The familiarity of the motion caught Thomas off guard. It was the same way Raymond had acted when they were deployed together. Nervous energy, constantly on edge. He hadn't been like that before. Without thinking, Thomas found himself standing up, walking towards Raymond, drawn to him by a force he couldn't explain. The moment Raymond saw him, his face seemed to harden, as though he was trying to hide something behind a mask of indifference. "Raymond," Thomas said, his voice quiet but firm. The name seemed to hang in the air between them, a bridge between their past and present. Raymond's eyes flicked toward him, then quickly away. "Thomas," he muttered, the greeting almost mechanical. "Didn't expect to see you here." "I work here," Thomas replied, unsure of what else to say. His heart was racing, not because of the awkwardness between them, but because of the lingering unease. He couldn't ignore the fact that something was off about Raymond. "What's going on, man? You've been acting strange. You look like you're in trouble." Raymond shifted uncomfortably, his fingers gripping the edges of the counter. "Nothing's going on. Just old habits, you know?" His voice was strained, as though he was forcing himself to keep it together. There was a flicker in his eyes, though, something Thomas couldn't quite place. Before Thomas could respond, the bank door opened with a soft jingle, and a customer walked in, breaking the tension between them. Raymond stepped forward to complete his transaction, and Thomas hesitated for a moment, unsure whether he should press the issue or step back. But before he could make a decision, Raymond's voice cut through the air. "Hey, Thomas." Raymond's voice was barely above a whisper. I need to talk to you after work. It's important." The words hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. The last time Raymond had asked to talk like this, it had been in the middle of their deployment, just before everything had started to fall apart. Thomas had no idea what this was about, but something deep inside him told him that he had to listen. "Yeah, sure," Thomas said, his voice almost automatic. "I'll wait for you when my shift ends." Raymond nodded curtly, quickly finishing his transaction and exiting the bank without another word. The rest of the day felt like an eternity. Every minute ticked by slowly, as if time had decided to stretch itself out, forcing Thomas to relive every moment of his past with Raymond. He had never thought he would see the man again, let alone stand across from him in this bank, with all the history between them hanging heavy in the air. By the time his shift ended, the bank was nearly empty. The sound of the clock, ticking on the wall, seemed to amplify in the silence of the room. Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to happen, something he wasn't ready for. He gathered his things slowly, the tension building with each passing second. His thoughts drifted back to the email from the day before, the one about Raymond's suspicious activity. Could this be the reason Raymond wanted to talk? Was he in trouble? Or was there more to this than just financial issues? Thomas knew that whatever it was, he was about to find out. As he walked out of the bank and into the parking lot, his mind raced. He didn't know what Raymond had gotten himself into, but one thing was for sure. This conversation was going to change everything. Raymond was waiting for him by the old, rusted car he'd had since their time in the military. The sight of it brought a wave of nostalgia and sorrow over Thomas, reminding him of the days when things were simpler, when everything had been in their control. But those days were long gone. "Hey, Raymond," Thomas said, trying to keep his voice steady, despite the nerves bubbling inside him. Raymond didn't respond at first. He stood there, staring at the ground, as if gathering his thoughts. Finally, he looked up at Thomas, his face pale and tired. "I've got a lot to explain," Raymond said, his voice hoarse, "but I'm not sure where to start." The wind howled through the empty parking lot as Raymond and Thomas stood facing each other, the weight of their shared past and unspoken words hanging heavily between them. Thomas could feel the old tension between them, that unspoken connection forged during their time in the military. But now, there was something different. Raymond wasn't the same man who had once been his closest friend. He looked older, broken, like a man carrying secrets that might tear him apart if exposed. "I've made a lot of mistakes, Thomas," Raymond finally spoke, his voice rough, as though every word was a struggle. "More than I ever thought possible. And I've been running from them for too long." Thomas's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea where this conversation was going, but he knew it wasn't going to be easy. Raymond had always been the strong one, the one who held it together when everyone else fell apart. To see him like this, vulnerable and broken, was unsettling. Raymond took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving the ground. "I didn't come back here just for a bank transaction, Thomas. I came because I need help, and I don't know where else to turn." Thomas's pulse quickened. His mind raced back to the email he had seen earlier, the suspicious activity report. Was Raymond in financial trouble? But something told him this was bigger than just money. He had known Raymond long enough to understand that there were things lurking beneath the surface, things he had never spoken about, even when they were close. "Raymond, what's going on?" Thomas asked, his voice steady but urgent. "You can talk to me. I don't care what it is, but you've got to let me in. I want to help." Raymond's eyes finally lifted, and for a brief moment, Thomas saw a flash of fear, a fear that shook him to his core. Raymond's hand trembled as he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, weathered envelope. He handed it to Thomas without a word. Thomas took the envelope, his fingers brushing against Raymond's. The moment their skin touched, it felt like everything around them went still. The world seemed to fade, and it was just the two of them, standing in the midst of something that felt like a turning point, a moment they would never be able to forget. He opened the envelope, his hands shaking slightly as he pulled out a series of photos and documents. As he scanned them, his stomach dropped. They were photographs of Raymond, yes, but also of people Thomas didn't recognize. Men in dark suits, their faces partially obscured. Some of the pictures were taken in dimly lit rooms, others at a private jet hangar. But what caught his eye the most was the last page of the packet, a contract, signed in what looked like Raymond's handwriting, but with terms that made no sense. The words were almost too blurry to read, but one thing was clear. Raymond was in deep with people who were not to be messed with. Thomas's throat tightened as he read through the documents. These were not the kind of papers anyone should be involved with. There were debts, threats, promises of deals that were more sinister than anything he could have imagined. Raymond, Thomas's voice faltered. What is all this? What have you gotten yourself into? Raymond's face twisted in pain, his eyes glistening with unspoken emotion. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, but I got in over my head. I thought I could handle it, but it's all falling apart now. They're watching me, Thomas. They know where I am. They know everything about me. And if I don't deliver, they'll come after the people I love. A cold shiver ran down Thomas's spine. The weight of Raymond's words hit him like a punch to the gut. They were talking about more than just money or bad choices. They were talking about lives at risk, about real danger. And what do you need from me? Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His mind was racing, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea how deep this went, how dangerous it might be. But what he did know was that Raymond was his friend. They had shared too much, seen too much together to turn away now. I need you to help me get out of this, Thomas, Raymond pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. I need someone who can help me disappear, someone who understands how to handle people like this. I've tried to do this on my own, but I can't keep running forever. Thomas swallowed hard, staring at the envelope in his hands. The path ahead was unclear, dangerous, and fraught with uncertainty. But Raymond was asking for help that Thomas wasn't sure he was equipped to give. And yet, as he looked into Raymond's eyes, he knew he couldn't turn his back on him. He couldn't leave him in the hands of the very people who had made these threats. You're not alone in this, Raymond, Thomas said, his voice steadier now. We'll figure this out. Together. Raymond let out a long breath, as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. But the relief was fleeting. The danger was still out there, still looming like a storm on the horizon. And Thomas knew they were both about to be pulled into something much bigger than they could have ever anticipated. Just as Thomas was about to say something else, the sound of a car engine roared in the distance. It was the unmistakable hum of a black SUV, its tires screeching as it came to a halt a few feet away. Raymond's face went pale, his body going rigid. They found me, Raymond whispered, panic rising in his voice. We need to go now. Before Thomas could react, Raymond grabbed his arm, pulling him toward his car. But as they both turned to run, a voice from behind them called out, sending a chill down their spines. Don't even think about it, Raymond. The voice was low, menacing, one Thomas instantly recognized from the photos. One of the men in the dark suits. The one who had signed the contract. And with him were two more figures, their faces obscured by sunglasses, their movements deliberate and precise. Raymond's eyes darted to Thomas. Run, Thomas, he shouted. But it was already too late. The cold, calculating voices of the men in suits echoed in Thomas's ears, and his heart raced as panic surged through his veins. Raymond's warning to run felt like a distant echo, swallowed by the impending danger. But Thomas couldn't move. His feet were planted in the gravel, his mind locked in place. The men moved closer, each step measured, purposeful. The tallest one, a dark-haired figure with a sharp jawline, stepped forward. His eyes, hidden behind dark sunglasses, seemed to pierce through the thick tension in the air. I'd advise you to stay where you are, gentlemen, the man said, his voice low, almost calm. But the menace behind it was clear. Raymond's face drained of color. You don't know what you're doing, he spat, his voice rising with desperation. You can't just threaten us like this. It's over for you guys. You'll regret this. But even as he spoke, it was clear he didn't believe his own words. The men in front of him weren't just regular thugs. They were professionals. Dangerous. Cold. Thomas could see the fear in Raymond's eyes, the weight of the situation crashing down on him like a ton of bricks. He had been trying to protect everyone around him for so long. But now, in this moment, he had no escape, no way out. But Thomas wasn't about to let him face this alone. Turning to Raymond, he gripped his arm. Listen to me. We can't do this on our own. We need help. We're not going to make it through this if we try to go head-to-head. Raymond's eyes searched his face for a moment, and for the first time, a flicker of hope returned. Maybe it was the years they had spent together in the military, or maybe it was just the shared understanding of what it meant to fight for someone else. But in that instant, Raymond seemed to realize that he wasn't alone anymore. Thomas pulled out his phone, hands shaking as he tried to keep his composure. With one swift motion, he dialed a number he had promised never to call again. After what felt like an eternity, the call connected. Thomas? The voice on the other end was rough, worn down by years of hard work, but unmistakably familiar. It was Sam, his old commanding officer from the military, the one person Thomas had hoped to never involve in this mess. But now, there was no other choice. Sam, we've got a problem, Thomas said, keeping his voice low as the suited men edged closer. I need you to help us. Raymond's in deep trouble, and I don't know how much longer we can keep these guys off our backs. A pause. Then Sam's voice, steady and resolute, came through the line. You're still in this, aren't you? You're still trying to save the world, even after everything we've been through. All right. Stay put. I'm sending help your way. Don't do anything stupid until we get there. Thomas let out a sigh of relief, but the moment didn't last long. The tall man in the suit took another step forward, his eyes narrowing behind his glasses. You really think someone is going to come save you? He asked, a dangerous smile tugging at his lips. No one's coming. You're already too deep in this to back out. But Thomas stood his ground, his heart beating fiercely in his chest. He wasn't about to give up on Raymond, not now, not when everything was on the line. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get worse, a sound echoed from behind them, a car engine roaring in the distance. Raymond's eyes flicked toward the sound, and he turned to Thomas, his voice shaky but filled with a surge of renewed hope. They're here. They actually came. Just as the suited men began to move, the roar of a black SUV broke through the tense silence. The vehicle screeched to a halt, and before the men could react, a group of well-trained professionals, men and women in tactical gear, flooded the parking lot. The suited men froze. They clearly weren't expecting this. The leader of the group, a woman with short, sharp features and a no-nonsense attitude, stepped out of the SUV. Her eyes locked with Thomas's for a split second before she turned to the men in suits. You don't want to do this, she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that demanded attention. The men exchanged nervous glances. For the first time, Thomas saw hesitation. But it was too late. The woman's team moved swiftly, overpowering the suited men in a matter of moments, forcing them to the ground, handcuffs securing their wrists in no time. As they worked, Raymond stepped back, his breath coming in shallow gasps. I don't know how to thank you, he muttered, his voice filled with disbelief. I never thought I'd get out of this. The woman nodded, glancing at her team to make sure everything was under control. You can thank your friend here, she said, nodding toward Thomas. He called us in. Thomas couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over him. His hands were still shaking, but the weight of fear that had gripped him for the past few hours was slowly lifting. Is it over? Raymond asked, his voice barely a whisper. For now, the woman answered, her eyes dark with knowledge of the situation. But you're not safe yet. This was just a small part of a much bigger operation. You've got enemies, Raymond, and they won't stop until they've gotten what they want. Raymond looked defeated for a moment, his shoulders slumping. But Thomas put a hand on his arm, giving him a firm, reassuring squeeze. You're not alone in this anymore, Thomas said, his voice filled with conviction. We'll take this one step at a time, but we'll get you out of this. You don't have to fight alone. Raymond nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude and uncertainty. What now? The woman in charge walked over to them. We'll get you into hiding, make sure you're protected. But it's going to take time. You've got a lot of people after you, and not all of them can be stopped so easily. The realization hit Raymond hard. His life was no longer his own. There was no going back to the man he had once been. But in this moment, surrounded by the people who had helped him, he found something he hadn't felt in years: hope. As the team began to pack up and prepare to leave, Thomas and Raymond exchanged one last look. It was a look that spoke volumes, of loss, of pain, but also of the possibility of redemption. They both knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, they believed that they could make it through. The SUV roared to life as Raymond and Thomas sat in the back, the tension still thick in the air. As the vehicle sped away from the scene, leaving the chaos behind, Raymond leaned back against the leather seat, his eyes closing briefly as though trying to shut out the storm that had unfolded only moments before. His fingers tapped nervously on his knee, betraying the calm exterior he was trying to maintain. Thomas stared out the window, his thoughts swirling. He had expected to spend the day on a normal shift at the bank, helping customers, processing transactions. Instead, he was now on the run with his old friend, tangled up in a web of danger that seemed to grow thicker by the hour. The world he had once known, where days were predictable and safe, felt so far away now. He glanced at Raymond. "You know, I never thought I'd be in a situation like this again," he said, his voice low. Raymond gave a short, humorless laugh. "Yeah, well, life has a funny way of throwing curveballs. I was hoping I could leave the past behind, but it's like it's been chasing me all this time. And now it's caught up with me." Thomas shook his head. "It's not just you, Raymond. This isn't just about you anymore. We're all in this together." Raymond turned his gaze to him, and for the first time since all of this began, he looked like he truly saw Thomas. The weight of their shared history and the trust that had once been the foundation of their friendship was there again. An unspoken understanding. "You're right," Raymond muttered. "I shouldn't have kept you in the dark. You don't deserve any of this. But now that it's all out in the open, it's too late to go back." Before Thomas could respond, the woman from earlier, the one leading the tactical team, turned from the front seat. Her sharp eyes landed on them, and there was no mistaking the authority in her demeanor. "We're not out of the woods yet," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "You're going to be safe for now, but there's a lot we need to sort through before this is over. And that includes you, Thomas. You might have thought you were just helping an old friend, but now you're involved. They won't stop just because you've been pulled into this." Thomas bristled at the implication. "What do you mean by that? What are we supposed to do now?" The woman's expression softened slightly, though her gaze remained steady. "For now, we need to lay low. I'll get you both settled somewhere secure. But there are forces at play here far bigger than you realize. You've got people in powerful positions after you, Raymond. They won't rest until they've got you back in their grip. And you," she said, turning her attention to Thomas, "can't afford to ignore this. Not anymore." Thomas looked over at Raymond, his mind spinning. The weight of their situation was beginning to settle in. This wasn't just some small-time deal gone wrong. This was bigger, much bigger. And no matter how far they ran, they were both caught in the undertow now. As the SUV drove down a long stretch of highway, the landscape around them slowly changed from urban sprawl to rural quiet. They were headed toward a safe house, a place that, according to the woman, would keep them hidden for as long as necessary. But even that wasn't guaranteed to be safe forever. There were always eyes watching, and in the world they now found themselves in, no place was truly secure. "We'll need to move quickly," the woman added, her voice a steady reminder of the reality they were facing. "We've got intel that suggests some of Raymond's former associates are already looking for him. They'll track him, and they'll come in fast. We don't have much time." Raymond clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "I never asked for any of this. I never wanted to bring this into your life, Thomas. This whole thing, it's my mess, not yours." Thomas placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We're in this together, Raymond. Whatever it takes, I've got your back." The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Raymond nodded, though the weight of everything seemed to bear down on him more with each passing moment. As the hours stretched on, they arrived at the safe house, a secluded cabin tucked away in the woods. It was far removed from the city, surrounded by dense trees and a sense of isolation that felt both calming and eerie. This was where they would stay, at least for now, a temporary haven. The woman, whose name was revealed to be Agent Carter, led them inside. The interior was sparse but functional, nothing luxurious, just the bare essentials to survive. Raymond and Thomas set down their bags, each of them trying to adjust to the gravity of what was happening. "You'll need to stay here for the foreseeable future," Agent Carter said, taking a seat at a small table and pulling out a folder filled with more documents. "We're going to lay low, gather information, and make a plan. But understand this, no matter how well we hide, the clock is ticking. We can only stay here as long as it's safe." Raymond nodded, though the concern in his eyes didn't leave. The walls felt like they were closing in around him, and every tick of the clock felt like a countdown. That night, as the fire crackled in the corner of the room, the two men sat quietly, each lost in their own thoughts. The weight of their predicament was undeniable. Raymond's past was coming back with a vengeance, and now Thomas had been dragged into it, whether he wanted to be or not. As the night deepened and the cabin fell into silence, Thomas couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought them here. In the span of just one day, their lives had been upended, and now they were fighting against forces they barely understood. But there was one thing Thomas knew for sure. He wasn't going to walk away from this. Not now. He owed it to Raymond, and he owed it to himself, to face whatever came next, head on. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a fight for redemption, and Thomas was ready to take it on. Days passed, each one blending into the next, as Thomas and Raymond kept to the safe house. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as they huddled inside, every sound from outside the cabin making them jump. Despite the calm, there was an undeniable tension in the air, a tension that no amount of silence could shake. Agent Carter remained a constant presence. She would check in regularly, her demeanor as cold and professional as ever, always gathering intel, always calculating their next move. Her team was working behind the scenes, sifting through information, watching every possible angle. But even with all her resources, there was a sense of urgency hanging over them. The clock was ticking, and Raymond's enemies weren't going to rest. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Carter entered the cabin, her face hard as steel. "It's time," she said, voice grave. Thomas and Raymond exchanged a look. It was a look that spoke volumes. There was no turning back now. They were about to face whatever came next, and there was no room for hesitation. Not anymore. "What do we do?" Raymond asked, his voice steady but his eyes betraying the worry he was trying so hard to conceal. "First, we move," Carter said. "We've identified their location. They're in the city, waiting for you to make a move. They think you're still hiding, that you're too scared to fight back. But that's about to change." Raymond stood up, fists clenched. "I'm not scared. I've spent my whole life running from my past. It's time to stand up to it." "Good," Carter nodded. "But you'll need backup, and not just from us." Thomas frowned, confusion creeping into his mind. Backup? From who? Before Carter could answer, the sound of tires skidding on gravel interrupted the moment. The door to the cabin slammed open, and a figure stepped into the room. Raymond froze, his breath catching in his throat. The figure was tall, wearing a long black coat and sunglasses even though it was late in the day. The man's presence was magnetic, and there was something oddly familiar about him. "Keanu?" Raymond asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and recognition. The man, none other than Keanu Reeves himself, gave a subtle nod. His eyes, warm yet unyielding, scanned the room, and then rested on Raymond. "I've been keeping an eye on you," Keanu said, his voice smooth but laced with an undeniable edge. "I know what's been going on, and I know what you're up against. I've got a few friends who are willing to help out." Raymond stared, unable to process what was happening. What are you doing here? How do you know?" "You'd be surprised how much I know about people when I need to," Keanu interrupted, flashing a wry grin. "I've got connections, and I'm here to make sure you survive." Thomas stood up, his jaw tightening. "So, this is it. You're going to help us take down the people after us?" Keanu nodded, his expression serious now. "Exactly. We need to act fast. This is bigger than you realize, Raymond. Those men you ran from, these aren't ordinary criminals. They have a network, a reach that stretches farther than you could imagine. And now they've made you their target. Raymond's heart hammered in his chest. So, what's the plan? Keanu didn't hesitate. You'll need to hit them where it hurts. They think they're invincible, untouchable. But that's where they're wrong. I've got intel, and I know where they're keeping their files, their dirty money. If we can take that down, we hit them at their core. Let's do it, Raymond said without missing a beat. He was done running. He was done being hunted. It was time to bring the fight to them. The group moved quickly, gathering their gear and making plans for the assault. Agent Carter briefed everyone on the layout of the building where their enemies were holed up. Raymond, Thomas, and Keanu suited up, adrenaline pumping through their veins. This wasn't a simple raid. It was their one chance to finally end this nightmare. As the team drove toward their destination, Raymond felt a surge of determination he hadn't felt in years. He had spent so long hiding from the past, but now, with these people, Thomas, Carter, and Keanu, by his side, he was ready to face the consequences of his actions. The city loomed ahead as the team arrived, a labyrinth of dark alleyways and towering buildings that seemed to close in around them. It was almost as if the night itself was conspiring against them, but Raymond didn't flinch. This was his fight now. They approached the building from the back, under the cover of darkness. Carter led the way, her movements sharp and deliberate. She spoke in hushed tones to Keanu and Raymond, guiding them through the narrow corridors and stairwells until they reached the upper levels. Inside, the building was a fortress. Locked doors, security cameras at every turn, guards standing watch like sentries. But the team moved with precision, eliminating obstacles in their path. They were ghost-like, slipping past security, as though they had done this 1,000 times before. Finally, they reached the vault. It was a massive, reinforced door, no doubt where the most dangerous secrets were locked away. Keanu turned to Raymond, his face serious. This is it. Everything you've been running from is behind this door. You ready? Raymond nodded. Let's finish this. With a swift motion, Keanu punched in the code, and the vault door groaned open. Inside, papers, files, and stacks of cash littered the room. It was a treasure trove of corruption, a collection of all the dirty dealings Raymond's enemies had conducted over the years. But it wasn't just the money that caught Raymond's attention. It was the files, the blackmail material, the damning evidence. This was the leverage they had used against him for so long. He stepped forward, his hands shaking, and grabbed the files. As he looked through them, realization hit him like a thunderclap. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about something bigger, something that had been manipulating people for far too long. We've got what we need, Raymond said, his voice steady. Let's bring this down. The team made their exit quickly, disappearing into the night before their enemies could even realize what had happened. As they drove away from the city, Raymond let out a long breath. It was over. The nightmare that had haunted him for so long was finally over. But even as the adrenaline began to wear off, he knew one thing for sure. There would be no going back to the life he had once known. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a man who had fought for his redemption, and he had one. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?